All right, so as you may know, and I hope you do, I take requests for videos, and this video is actually being made by request. I have a very brilliant and fun friend who requested a video on the eighth house and sexual energy. So here's the controversial thing, because that's a very common and widespread modern idea, is that the eighth house governs sexuality. There's an idea that because it's the house after the one of relationship, the seventh house, then it makes sense that it has to do with that. Plus, the idea of the modern idea of the eighth house is transformation, which, especially in a New Age context, just sounds very positive and great. And so, ideas of like sex as being transformative and stuff. And it's not that it's wrong, but it's rarely right. So I want to kind of go into the house I think we should be talking about, and that's the fifth house. So I'm going to talk about specifics about your fifth house cusp. But I'm going to start off with just telling you why I say what I just said, and then I will at the end of this video come back and nevertheless talk a little bit about sexuality in the eighth house, because there is something to say. But let me start with this book. Deborah Holding's book, The Houses, Temples of the Sky. Strongly recommend this book. Deborah Holding, someone that I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Deborah, but she's someone that I respect very much. She went back into a lot of ancient source texts and tried to figure out what the houses have meant, since the beginning, since the ancients, and kind of synthesized all that and went into all the different sources. But she doesn't really, even though it's very scholarly, the work that went into it, it's presented in a very straightforward and practical manner. She contrasts the different houses, like the second with the eighth, for example, and for the axis of houses, and as well does each house individually. So anyway, Deborah Holding makes the point that the eighth house traditionally is called the house of death, the gate of hell. It's a house that basically connotes loss and the grief that surrounds it. So usually, she says what she says, and it's kind of like a disturbing thought, and I can see why she says it. She says any type of sex that's associated with this house is kind of grisly thought. And without her saying it, she seems to be implying it would govern like the kind of like a basically sexual violation that would cause one tremendous grief and loss. So it's not exactly like the positive, bubbly question that my friend's asking. So I am going to come back, and I think there's something a little bit more positively sexual that can be governed by the eighth house. So I'll go back into that. I'll come back to the eighth house at the end of this video and say a little bit more, slightly in contrast with Holding. I guess in a sense, I'm not as traditionalist as she is, although I do strongly believe in kind of building off of tradition, so I do respect her quite a bit. Anyhow, the house that is much more appropriate in my view for talking about your sexual energy and what it says about you is the fifth house. So the fifth house, again, in a modern context, we think of it as governed by Leo because it's the fifth sign, and if you kind of start with the idea of the first house, it has to do with Aries, so there's a lot of stuff around that. But anyways, regardless of if you accept that logic, the idea is the fifth house is its fertility and fun. To be very brief about it, so it's sort of like the idea of creativity, what you're that fun, almost personal. It's not a selfless house. It's a house of personal fun. What pleases you, what's exciting, what's bubbly and fun. So sex for pleasure as well as procreation is governed by the fifth house. So let's go through just the signs on the cusp. So in case you're wondering, you should look at whatever sign is on the left side of the fifth house. That's where it begins, because the sixth house is after that. So you look for what is the sign on the cusp of your sixth house, the beginning, fifth house. What is the beginning of that house for you? So I'll start with Aries. So an Aries lover is ardent, and they're somebody who is very spontaneous. They might be a little on the selfish side, but they're sure as heck energetic and fun. And stuff like that. So, that's the Aries, fifth house cusp. Taurus is sensual, probably less apt to be selfish, but very sensual, very bodily. I would imagine somebody who is a Taurus fifth house cusp is a very lovely person to have sex with. Very large with their different types of sensations that they enjoy, and they also enjoy giving. Gemini. Certainly less inventive, or let's say like the territory is smaller with a Gemini than a Taurus. However, Gemini is fun-loving. They might enjoy sexual games, role-playing, so a whole bunch of different kind of more intellectual, but also very, very inventive and fun and again spontaneous. Now, Cancer, fifth house cusp, would be somebody who is much more on the caring side. So on the good side of that, it can be somebody who's very attentive to their lover and what they enjoy. Of course, bringing in so many emotions can also kind of like make pleasurable, sex for pleasure kind of a short-lived game. It could be a little bit tougher because there's too much involvement for that. But if it's in a more context of a relationship, for example, it certainly could be, and that caring Cancer nature can be very nourishing to someone who enjoys that. Leo being this house in the modern thought. So the Leo is both romantic, and they might employ like clothing and sort of like costuming and things like that, or simply just sort of romantic bearing. With regard to that, which doesn't have to translate into commitment or anything like that, but it can, so be careful of that. Just, if you're a Leo, just take it easy and stuff like that, but on the fifth house cusp, I mean. So yeah, it's a sign of a lot of enjoyment and creativity, and sort of like a very sunny bearing with regard to it. So there's a lot of fun to be had by Leo, fifth house. Now Virgo is a little bit more, I guess, prissy. It's a little bit of an unkind word, but a Virgo fifth house might have a little bit of a hard time letting go because of the concern with both hygiene in a physical sense, but also in a more like mental sense of wanting to make a separation between self and other, which kind of gets in the way sometimes of sexual fun. But I think there's ways of compensating for that to make it where it's very much, you can bring out the earthy practicality of Virgo, and in a very enjoyable, down-to-earth way. I could see that happening there. And then Libra could be or should ideally be somebody who's, again, giving, somebody who's gracious in their sexual bearing, and also into aesthetics. Somewhat similar, a little bit similar to the Leo or the Taurus, maybe even more so, maybe even more visual. Somebody who cares a great deal about beauty and stuff like that. So both they may take care of themselves and they may look for that in a partner. And then Scorpio. Scorpio, of course, is a very intense lover. Now, the part of Scorpio that one has to watch out for is being selfish, because the Scorpio is a very ego-driven sign. But on the positive side, a Scorpio is very intense, very driven, and so if they're attracted to you, or if you're a Scorpio attracted to a Scorpio fifth house cusp, there can be a lot of energy to really like throw into the sex and make that very exciting and fun and easygoing and stuff like that. So there could be depth there. If there's depth, it might be obsessive, which can be good, especially if you're into like, S&M or something like that, or other types of games like that. But in any case, sometimes it can be not that way, but it could certainly be very fun and very powerful. And then Sagittarius is somebody for whom sex is an adventure. So Sagittarius is the fifth house cusp. Somebody who's very broad-minded, who enjoys a long journey with sexuality. That can be very pleasurable, especially for a woman. And my experience of people who are Sagittarius influenced lovers is that, which have actually been female, the ones that I've known. So I don't know about the male side of this, but they're definitely not afraid of the body. They're definitely open, and that makes for a very enjoyable experience. Capricorn on the fifth house cusp. This is somebody who might be a little bit overly serious, although especially as they age, the Capricorn can become more and more perverted. So it's kind of a funny sign, because at first they could even be a little bit cold or a little bit unwilling to kind of let go and stuff like that because of the Saturn influence of Capricorn. But there's a seriousness about it, and sort of like a big picture, which again kind of clashes a little bit with the idea of sex for fun. But ultimately, as they age, they can be somebody who's very perverted. Like if you scratch a Capricorn, you get a pervert, essentially, eventually. And so that can be very exciting if you're into that. And then, so Aquarius on the fifth house cusp, somebody who is quirky and interesting and strange and willing to try anything once. So they're definitely a great person to experiment in sexual things with. They can be very, anytime you have Aquarius and sex mixing together, you have intellectual which means the ideas of things are as exciting, or more so even, than the physical, sensual parts of it. This person could be very sensitive physically, but certainly in an intellectual sense, they're very turned on by strange ideas. And then Pisces. The Pisces on the fifth house cusp is interesting because, again, there's a little bit of a caution with the water sign, which is getting very into, falling into kind of a deeper relationship than is warranted potentially here. So that's a danger with Pisces there. But a Pisces also has a lot of versatility in sex. And a lot of sensuality. So it's definitely a very interesting and fun lover. I hope I haven't skipped anything there. I think I went through all the signs. I'll come back if I didn't. So I'm just going to now transition back to the 8th house. So let's talk about the 8th house from a modern perspective, but not the typical one where it says it's governing sexuality, which I don't agree with, because again, it's just traditionally a house of death and loss. So when we talk about transformation today, we might have a rosier view, and I think that's warranted, than the ancients. So first of all, we have a different view on death itself, in Thelema especially. So essentially, if anything's to be lamented, is the fact that we can't die. So in other words, that we are actually immortal beings who undergo just constant change, and in that sense, there's a lot of loss. So we have to be willing to let go of things that are passing away out of our lives, and if we're identified with those things, that can be very painful. And a lot of times, most of our problems are caused by hanging on to stuff. That's just the way it is. But when we come to talk about transformation, there's a lot of liminal experiences that can go into the 8th house. So things that are kind of boundary between what's considered normal and then sort of extraordinary or occult experience. We could also look at the 8th house as governing the unconscious, kind of coming into our lives. So it could be through dreams, visions, rituals, and indeed sexual rituals as well. So there can be a tantric sexuality if it's engaged as genuine transformation or shamanism, if you will. But the problem with that is that most people aren't capable of that. Most people will always have an egotistical investment in it. True 8th house experience will take down the ego. It will annihilate the ego. It will dissolve the ego. So it's going to have to challenge your actual ego investment. So if you look at the sign on the cusp there, and you are actually someone who's willing to let go of your ego, who's actually willing to have it whittled away and have yourself be more naked to the universe, more of a servant of the divine than somebody who's in it for a fun experience, personal growth, etc. Which nothing wrong with that if you're into personal growth, but if you're into personal growth, I would say ignore this whole section on the 8th house because it really doesn't apply to you. But if you're into truly putting yourself out there to be destroyed by your spirituality, then yeah, the 8th house can be also about your sexuality if you happen to use sex in your spirituality, as many Thelemites do. So anyhow, then you're looking at the 8th house cusp, and pretty much everything I just said can apply there too. So the Aries is somebody who is very spontaneous, very impulsive, very ardent in how they approach, basically the dissolution of their ego through sex. Taurus, very sensually approaching the dissolution of their ego through sex, so the body almost becomes a field of annihilation of the ego. So it's like where those experiences are just allowed to happen. The sensation is focused on, and the ego is those investments are allowed to dissolve through those experiences. Gemini, here we have somebody who would approach that transformation process through basically becoming versatile and becoming available in different ways to a different partner. So the ego lost there would be predicated on being about what the other person's doing and are into, so that you're kind of meeting them where they are. That's a communication idea, and not trying to get something for yourself. The Cancer is, again, basically like the kind of ego dissolution that a parent can have for a child could be applied in a sexual context in appropriate ways, through basically care, love, worship, in a truly giving and self-negating way. The 8th house Leo cusp would be somebody who allows the creativity of a god or a goddess to work through them in the sexual context. So there could be like an invocation involved with that. And of course, if you ever do that, by the way, always banish before and afterwards, because you never want to leave that door open after you walk out of the chamber. That's very dangerous. In any case, that would be a potentially Leo, sort of a theatrical but sincere, like allowing something else to use your vehicle. And then, let's see, 6th house, Virgo. So the Virgo would be kind of a similar idea to the Cancer in one sense, which is the body as food for that deity, that god. And it would probably have to be ritualized for that to happen. And then the Libra, it's again about creating an aesthetic experience, but it would have to be not so much for the personal enjoyment of it, but again relating to the particular intent of the operation. Because there it's again about the other, and in this case the other can both be the partner and the deity that's being served essentially by this operation. And then Scorpio, it would be really about, like, this could be a very intense 8th house cusp, because that's sort of like now we say the ruler of the 8th house, so in a modern sense. So we're talking about, you could have very intense experiences, mind altering. You could be using substances to achieve this as well. Going into dark spaces, going into potentially very frightening spaces with using sex as a way to raise the energy. So that would be a Scorpio approach to this house. Sagittarius would be a very philosophical and broad-minded approach to it, where it would be with the idea of sort of allowing a true adventure, allowing something to happen where you're wandering far afield. So it could be visionary as well. It could be going into spaces that are not known or have been explored, but you're re-exploring them. And learning about something from a big perspective. So again, it's not about the ego, it's about a bigger piece for humanity. And then Capricorn would be becoming sort of like the ideal form in the sexual act, whatever, becoming like a container for something much larger than yourself, surrendering the personal and allowing something large to be emerging through your operations, your sexual operations there. And then Aquarius would be where you're kind of like channeling the lightning of genius through that. So there could be, again, invocational aspects of it where you're using sexuality to power lightning happening there. So because now we think of Aquarius as governed by Uranus, which is the universal will. So also it would have to be with regard to benefiting humanity as a whole, benefiting all beings, something, again, for all and not for you in particular. Finally, Pisces would be directly about dissolving the ego. It would be directly about using sexuality as a dissolving substance, if you will. It could be annihilating the self through those experiences, and that would be the intent as well as the effect of them. Well, I hope that is helpful. So if you're only interested in just the sex or fun part, that was in the earlier part of the video regarding the 5th house. Thank you, and again, keep those questions coming.